What was the biggest lesson we learned from both the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and also the Ever Given ship stuck in the Suez Canal? There were two major disruptions, one obviously longer than the other, that impacted your operations and the ability to respond to challenges.
I think if I look at it from my side, I think actually that there was, if I start on the positive side, there was actually a positive consequence in this, and that is, I think, the importance of having a reliable and an efficient supply chain became known to everyone in the world. I worked in shipping for more than 25 years. For the first time, my children, who are in that close to 20 years old, knew what I was doing, because all of a sudden they actually understood, oh, this is what you do. So I think for the entire world, not only in the supply chain industries, it became apparent the importance of the supply chain and our reliance on the supply chain. Granted, in many ways it became important, or it became apparent, because it was a negative discovery. All of a sudden there were certain things we didn't have. There were certain things that took longer and so on. But I think the positive side was clearly this importance that there need to be on the supply chain, I think became very, very apparent in this.
Do you think it's actually going to become onshoring and nearshoring? And we almost got spoiled, if you will, by just-in-time logistics and what we see in China because of COVID and some of the lockdowns. Does it force dispersion?
I clearly think so. I think onshoring, nearshoring, I will be a part of it. I don't think it's one where it's either one or the other. I think it will be a mix. And you see that depending on what goods you're transporting as well, what is beneficiary to do close to yourself and what is not, both based on value of what you're producing, but also on criticality. So I think in the future we'll see a more diverse spectrum of production in terms of onshoring, nearshoring, but also having these very, very large industrial production areas as what we've seen in the past.
You almost shocked me on the panel when you talked about the lack of transparency and inefficiency in shipping, and particularly for energy products. What do you think needs to happen to make the industry much more efficient, transparent, which plays into the energy transition and efficiency, does it not?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things in this that I think is very important. First of all, I'm supporting the energy companies on their supply chain of production, not on the supply chain for bringing their products out, but on the supply chain of the production side is incredibly fragmented. And what needs to happen is that you need to have someone who has a holistic overview of the entire supply chain. So if an energy company today orders something, they actually don't know when it's going to arrive at the various different points, which means that it makes their planning very difficult. It means that they overstock their inventory, because they need to, in the energy sector, it's very important that you keep the energy production constant. So they can't allow for any disruptions, which means that if they don't trust their own supply chain, they'll have to overorder in terms of having inventory in place. I think when you look at the energy transition and our ESG, I think there's a couple of different things one have to be aware of, or three segments you can say. One is, what kind of fuel are we burning? What are we basing our supply chain on? The other one is carbon capture. And then the third one, which I actually think is the lowest hanging fruit, is the efficiency of it. So we've seen in our data, which we've looked at for the last 3 years over a number of different oil fields, that we believe we can actually deliver the goods out into the energy field 30% faster, sailing 40% less. That actually does not come with a lot of investment, but what it does require is that we take a bigger part of the supply chain. So you need someone to manage the bigger part of the supply chain you manage, the more easy it is for you to harvest those inefficiencies in between that will allow you to have that energy saving.
It's so interesting, and the role of artificial intelligence, I think, would be even bigger, and blockchain in that process, would it not be?
Well, I think so. I think so. In our company, we've developed very, very. My IT people say that they're very complex, but the fact is they're very simple algorithms for how you do route planning, and we apply those in our operations along with blockchain technology of creating transparency through, and the savings are potentially huge in this. And I have to stress, when it comes to the energy side of the energy producing, what we are doing on that side of it is not new. You've seen it in many other industries. If you look at the FedEx of the world, the UPSs of the world, they've spent decades trying to fine-tune how can you actually make the most efficient supply chain for this. So as in the energy sector, we simply just have to do what other industries are doing, and we could reap some of the same benefits.
Okay, final question was on the transition itself and the kind of the narrative around it. There's two things, is that we have the environmental community on one side, people involved in the energy supply chain on the other, and this huge white space in between where the lack of collaboration and dialogue seems to be missing in such a profound way that we can't work together in what some would call a very needed radical collaboration.
Yes, I think, as I said on the panel, for me, I think we need to keep the conversation very real. I think what is missing on today, and you mentioned it on the panel, is on one hand you have the environmentalists, which we all agree with the intentions, but we have to be realistic around where we are today. And that's not one truth. So Europe is in a different place than the US. US and Europe is in a different place than Africa and Asia and Middle East, and we all have different circumstances and different journeys that we are on in terms of economic growth, in terms of population, in terms of energy use per capita, and so on and so on. And we need to have a very realistic conversation around that. And it cannot be one conversation that is valid for, let's say, Europe, is translated to the rest of the world, because it simply will not work. And I think there, as on the environmental side, we need to be more realistic around that conversation. I think on our side, on the supply chain side, and particularly in the energy sector, I think we need to be much better at highlighting all the initiatives that we are doing and all the things that we are trying to accomplish and the innovations that have been done. Because many times I believe in the public eye, it's as if we've stood still for a couple of decades. And that's simply not true. The amount of investment and the amount of R&D that have gone in to making this a greener production of energy is quite amazing. And also the carbon capture. There's a lot of areas that I think we need to be much better at marketing, and therefore getting support around, therefore getting further investments around, and therefore developing it further. We had that conversation on the panel that you have some banks, financial institutions that are shying away from anything that is oil and gas, for instance. But is that really the answer? Shouldn't the answer really be, is this an oil and gas that is on the right track? Because oil and gas will have to be part of the transition, regardless of how we look at it. We cannot abandon oil and gas tomorrow. Quite frankly, I'm not even sure we could abandon coal tomorrow. So therefore, we have to have a more realistic conversation around it. And that is both sides. It's not one side coming towards the other, it's both sides coming towards each other.